Welcome to Insights with Dana Oakley Samard. Now that you've had a chance to watch my video about authenticity and inauthenticity, I wanted to look a little bit at where do we see this in our day-to-day life. And I think that there's really not any better place to look for evidence of authenticity or inauthenticity than on TV. Right? We all watch it, we see it, we kind of fall in love with these characters that we find on TV and in sitcoms and all that stuff. And I can't tell you how many times in a session I will refer to certain characters from shows that I like to watch to help really hit home the idea or the concept that I'm trying to talk to a client about. So I found one that works really, really well to sort of describe inauthenticity and sort of the risks involved with inauthenticity, as I mentioned in my previous video. So the one I'd like to talk about today is Seinfeld and our good friend George Costanza. And I think an episode that really, really, really captures sort of the inauthenticity that poor George Costanza is going through is in the episode called The Invitations, and this is episode 22, season 7. And for those of you who have not seen this episode, this is the episode where George Costanza's fiancée, Susan, dies because of licking the envelopes because of the really poor quality of glue on their wedding invitations. So she passes away because of this glue, the toxicity of the glue. So I've been thinking a lot about this, and every time I watch it, I'm just like astounded and humored, of course, because George was so relieved that she died so that he could finally get out of this relationship, because he's not been happy with her pretty much ever that he's ever been with her. So I've been thinking about it, and I want to just kind of give you a little bit of a lead up and sort of apply everything that I've been talking about in my previous video to how this fits with George Costanza. So the reason he got engaged to begin with was because he made a pact with Jerry. And the pact is kind of based out of fear, and that's going to be my sort of counseling angle on this, is that it's based out of fear. What they realized was that they're both getting really old, they're both being really picky about people, they're kind of immature, and they really want to just be normal men. And so they both decided that they were going to change their lives. And so upon some, reflection time that George was having at the ocean, he decided, he had this vision in his mind of Susan, and decided that she is who I should be with. And so he kind of idealized the relationship that he had had with her in the past as being really wonderful. But in reality, of course, we know that he wasn't really happy with her at that time either. So when I say that he got engaged out of fear, he's also has said things in other episodes about how he really didn't want to end up being like, an old man, like sitting around in his underwear eating cheesies, because he isn't going to do his laundry and he doesn't have any kids, he doesn't have a wife, he's just going to be miserable. So because of this pact with Jerry and because of this fear of being alone and miserable, it started to make him think, oh my goodness, I better find someone. And Susan was who popped into his mind. So it's interesting to think about that and see all the things that have happened from the point of the engagement to the point of her death. And some of the things he tried to do that have everything to do with being inauthentic, because he would not admit to himself, well, he admitted to himself, I guess, he would not admit to Susan that he was unhappy and he wouldn't leave the relationship. So instead of just being upfront, instead of being honest, instead of being brave enough to face the uncomfortable feelings and the results that might come from expressing those feelings, he plotted ways to have her break up with him. He tried smoking, he tried to get her to sign a prenuptial agreement, and none of these things worked. Then he would talk to Elaine and Kramer and Jerry about how much he didn't like her and like all these things that, he felt about her, and they knew how he felt, but he would never share with her. He tried to postpone the wedding and the engagement as long as possible. At one point, he even completely broke down, saying that it was just too soon, which I thought was actually quite authentic of him. But he didn't actually go ahead and say the whole story, which was, I just don't want to get married at all. So he tried to postpone things, he plotted things, and then he just kind of resigned himself to a miserable life with Susan, a woman he didn't even like. That's really intense. And so as I'm watching these episodes unfold, and then I realize, like, wow, he's instead of like just breaking up with her and going through that uncomfortable conversation, he just is gonna like live his whole life being miserable. He's willing to sacrifice the happiness of his whole life because he doesn't want to have an uncomfortable conversation. He wants to avoid being honest. This is like, what? Intense. So I just want to point out that though it was humorous and it was funny, and you know, of course we all enjoy it, and here we are talking about it, it's really, really sad that George felt so terrified of being authentic, of tapping into his real feelings, tapping into his honesty, tapping into his sense of, like, you know, fear that he was having about being in this relationship, and did everything but be honest about it. He did everything to avoid having the conversation. He did everything to get out of having to be accountable for his feelings and to just kind of end it. So sometimes this happens, you know, we live our lives and we do everything we can to avoid being uncomfortable about the thing that we are nervous about doing or saying or feeling. But when you look at what happens as a result, we avoid stuff, we get angry, we isolate ourselves, we decide that, okay, I guess I just better be miserable instead. That's a better option than being honest and being free and happy. So that's something really to consider. And this is the cost of inauthenticity. He was willing to sacrifice his whole life being miserable because he was uncomfortable to talk to Susan about his feelings. That's really serious, and that's going to cause depression. He was already miserable. It's going to cause depression. It's going to be, anxiety might come up. He's going to be disconnected from her, disconnected from himself, because the closer he gets to himself, the more his self is going to require him to be authentic and honest and see what's really going on. So we end up, when I mentioned in my previous video about losing parts of ourselves, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So losing the connection to self, losing the access to happiness, losing the route to knowing what our feelings are and feeling content and satisfied within our own bodies. So that's a little bit about George Costanza. And I'm sure that I will talk about him again because he is full of great examples of kind of what people do in life and what we can learn from him and how to maybe do things a little bit differently. So thank you so much for watching this video about George Costanza and how he relates to authenticity. I'll see you next time.